This is an original, fictional horror story created for entertainment. Any resemblance to real people, places, or events is purely coincidental. I wasn't supposed to find the hiking log. If I'd followed the rules, I would have filed my research report, collected my grant money, and moved on to the next project. But in September 2024, while cataloging archived materials at the Old Faithful Visitor Center, I found it tucked behind a removed cabinet in the basement, a leather-bound logbook that documented nearly every entry and exit on Ridgeline Trail between March and September 2009, the year before the National Park Service officially closed it. The Park Service's public statement was bureaucratic and vague: trail closure due to geological instability and wildlife management concerns. No reopening date scheduled. 15 years later, the trail remained barricaded with heavy iron gates and warning signs. No geological surveys were ever published. No wildlife incidents appeared in the official incident reports I'd requested. The closure didn't make sense, so I'd made it my thesis project, the first researcher in over a decade to seriously investigate what happened. I should have left that logbook where I found it. My name is Dr. Sarah Vance, and I was a geological consultant brought in by the University of Wyoming to study Yellowstone's thermally active zones. My actual responsibility was straightforward: update the 1987 subsurface mapping of geyser fields and hot spring corridors. But I've always been the type to pull on threads. In this case, the Ridgeline Trail was one of those threads that wouldn't stop unraveling. Ridgeline had been popular before the closure, moderately difficult. 7-mile round trip, offering views of both the Gibbon Falls area and parts of the Mammoth Hot Springs Plateau. Hundreds of people hiked it annually. Then, in late 2009, without warning, it was closed. The Park Service never provided details beyond those two vague reasons. When I'd called the regional office to ask for closure documentation, the woman on the phone became noticeably uncomfortable. "I'd have to check our records," she'd said. That was a long time ago. People involved have mostly retired or transferred. The logbook changed everything. The entries began in March 2009, maintained by volunteer rangers who staffed the trailhead. Simple notations: names, dates, times in and out, weather conditions, sometimes notes about group size or animal sightings. Nothing unusual through April and May. Hikers came and went. The trail worked as intended. Then, in late June, the entries began to shift. The first odd note appeared on June 23rd. Hiker M. Chen reported unusual rock formations near mile marker 4. Appeared fresh, newly exposed. Collected sample for geological review. 2 days later, returned to site with park geologist Thompson. Formation no longer visible. No rock disturbance noted. Chen must have been mistaken or disoriented. I photographed every page with my phone. My hands were shaking. July brought more entries. July 20, 2 hikers reported strange smell near junction with old mining trail. Described as metallic chemical. No visible source. No hazard detected. July 15th, morning group reported turning back at mile marker 5. Said air felt wrong. No technical issue found by ranger sweep. The language was clinical, but I could read the anxiety between the lines. These were trained observers trying to rationalize unexplained phenomena. July 2020, the entry that made my throat tighten. Solo hiker D. Morrison reported person in back of group during ascent who was not part of his registered party. Person wore old park ranger uniform vintage, unclear era. When Morrison turned to speak to the individual, no one was there. Reported again at mile marker 3 during descent. Morrison visibly shaken. Recommended psychological evaluation. I sat back from the logbook. A figure in ranger uniform that disappeared. A phantom hiker. The entries in August accelerated. Multiple groups reported hearing footsteps behind them that would stop when they stopped. Others mentioned the smell again, now described more specifically as sulfur mixed with something organic, something like spoiled meat, One group found a ranger's badge in the trail, dated 1987, pristine and undamaged, despite supposedly sitting outside for who knows how long. The final entry in the logbook was dated September 12th, 2009. Trail closed effective immediately by order of Regional Director Hutchins. No further volunteer staffing. No hikers permitted. Gate installation beginning. This decision is final. Below that, in different handwriting, someone had added a single line that appeared to be scratched in after the fact. We should have closed it sooner. I didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about that 1987 Ranger's badge, about the footsteps that followed people down a mountain, about a figure that vanished. The next morning, I drove to the Ridgeline trailhead. It was early October, a Thursday, and the park was quieter than usual. The trail entrance was exactly as described. 2 heavy iron gates, chained together, with large warning signs about geological hazard and Park Service authority. The gate had been there for 15 years. Weather and time had oxidized it to rust-stained brown. I could easily have walked around it. The forest extended past the barrier, and hikers had clearly considered the same option. I could see faint social trails worn into the pine needles where people had circled the gate. But I didn't go around. Not yet. Instead, I drove back to the visitor center and spent 4 hours in the archive looking for anything else related to Ridgeline Trail. I found the 1987 Ranger rotation records. There had been a ranger named David Whitmore assigned to that district from 1985 to 1989. In 1987 specifically, he'd been listed as performing trail maintenance and leading naturalist walks. But when I searched the personnel database for what happened to Ranger Whitmore, I hit a wall. His employment record ended abruptly on August 14, 1987, with a one-line notation, transferred, no reason given, no forwarding information. I then did something I wasn't supposed to do. I called a retired ranger named George Coulter, who'd worked the Mammoth District in the late 1980s. I'd found his name in the old staff directories. He was 73 now, living in Billings, Montana. I'm doing research on historical trail management, I told him, which was technically true. I came across references to Ranger David Whitmore. Do you remember him? The line went quiet for a long moment. Why do you want to know about Whitmore? He asked carefully. He worked on Ridgeline Trail. I'm just trying to compile a complete history. Don't. He cut me off. His voice had shifted, become serious. Don't compile any history of Ridgeline Trail. Close the book, put it back, and stop asking questions. But I found the logbook from 2009, and I don't care what you found. Listen to me. That trail is closed for reasons that have nothing to do with geology or wildlife. It's closed because the people who made that decision 20 years ago were making the right call. Some things need to stay closed. He hung up. I should have listened. Instead, I called the Park Service's Public Records Office and filed a FOIA request for any incident reports, medical records, or injury reports related to Ranger David Whitmore, and the dates, August 1987, and also any reports from the Ridgeline Trail area, dating from June through September 2009. I knew bureaucratic requests took time, so I decided to do something more direct. 2 days later, on a Saturday morning, I drove back to Ridgeline and brought a backpack, water, a flashlight, and a satellite communicator. The sun was high and the weather clear. I wore sturdy boots and bright clothing. I told myself I was being careful. I told myself I was being rational. I told myself I was just going to hike a 1/4 mile up the trail, look around, and come back down. I've never been very good at lying to myself. The gate wasn't actually locked. The chain was ornamental, wound loosely through the metal bars but not securing anything. A strong pull and it fell away. The gate itself swung open with effort, decades of rust scraping against metal. The trail beyond was overgrown but still passable. 15 years without maintenance had narrowed it, allowed the surrounding forest to creep inward. Lodgepole pines crowded both sides, their needles thick and brown on the ground. The air smelled like pine pitch and earth and the faint mineral trace that came from being near geothermal features. I checked my watch. 10:47 a.m. I would go to mile marker 1, photograph anything unusual, and return by noon. The trail climbed steadily. My quad muscles burned as I pushed upward. Behind me, Yellowstone opened up the forested valleys. The faint plume from Old Faithful in the distance. The vast emptiness of the park. I reached mile marker 1 around 11:15. The marker was a faded rectangular sign nailed to a lodgepole, nearly swallowed by lichen. I photographed it and took a few shots of the trail ahead, which continued to climb and bend around an outcropping of darker rock. Then I noticed something odd. The forest floor to my right, near the marker, had been disturbed. Not recently. The disturbance was old, weathered, but significant. It looked like something had been dug up, a large hole then refilled and covered over. The vegetation growing over it was different from the surrounding area, slightly more vibrant. I moved closer, studying it. The rectangular shape was still visible beneath the needles and low brush. Whatever had been buried there was roughly the size of a coffin. My heart was moving faster than the hike justified. I looked up the trail. Nothing moved. No sound except wind in the highest pine branches. I was very aware, suddenly, that I hadn't seen another person in the park for the last few hours. I had left a note at my hotel, indicating I was doing research, but I hadn't told anyone exactly where. I took another photo of the disturbed ground and continued forward. The trail grew narrower as it climbed. The trees pressed closer. The light filtered down in thin green shafts, and the air took on a different quality, damper, cooler. Despite the warm morning, I realized I could smell something beneath the pine. The smell from the logbook entries. Sulfur and something else, something like rot, but not quite like any decay I'd encountered in nature. At mile marker 2, the smell was stronger. I could also hear water, a faint rushing that didn't match Gibbon Falls, which should have been miles away. I found the source after walking another 100 yards, a small hot spring that wasn't on any map I'd seen. Water was a pale blue-green, steaming even in the October air. The rock around it was stained white and yellow and black, mineral deposits in strange patterns. Stranger still were the objects in the water. At first, I thought they were rocks, but as I approached, keeping a safe distance from the acidic thermal pool, I realized I was looking at bones. Bleached white bones, some partially dissolved, arranged in the water in no natural pattern. They were too large to be animal. They were human. I fumbled my phone out with shaking hands and photographed them, zooming in so the detail was clear. Several distinct long bones, what appeared to be ribs, something that might have been a skull fragment. The position suggested they had been placed deliberately in the water. My breathing had become shallow. I looked around the clearing, suddenly aware of how alone I was, how far from the road, how easy it would be to disappear here. That was when I heard the footsteps. They were coming down the trail, the same trail I'd climbed. Steady, unhurried steps, the sound of boots on dirt and needles. The gait was even, mechanical almost. I couldn't see around the bend yet, but the sound was getting closer. "Hello?" I called out. "Park Service?" The footsteps stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. I stood on the edge of that impossible hot spring, surrounded by pine, with bones steaming in geothermal water, and nothing moved. Then the footsteps resumed. But they weren't moving toward me anymore. They were moving away, back down the trail, walking steadily down the mountain at a pace that suggested someone hurrying. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I turned and walked quickly back the way I'd come, my careful research intentions abandoned entirely. I told myself I would return to the park offices, file my report with whatever I'd found, let the authorities handle it. My expertise was in geology, not in investigating burial sites or abandoned hikers or whatever horror had compelled someone to close this trail. I made it back to mile marker 1 in less than 20 minutes. The disturbed ground was gone. I mean, the physical shape was still there, the slightly raised earth where something had been buried. But the rectangles was now covered by a light dusting of fresh pine needles. Not years of needles, fresh, recent, as if it had been carefully raked smooth while I was deeper on the trail. I ran the rest of the way to the gate. The chain was back in place when I arrived at the trailhead, coiled exactly as it had been when I found it. The gate was closed. My car was alone in the small parking area, untouched. I sat in the driver's seat for 10 minutes with the doors locked, my phone in my hand, before I could bring myself to drive away. The FOIA request came back 3 weeks later. The documents were heavily redacted, but what remained was enough to answer most questions. In August 1987, Ranger David Whitmore had been reported missing during a solo shift on Ridgeline Trail. Search and rescue had recovered his remains 2 days later, partially submerged in a thermal pool approximately 2.2 miles up the trail. The case was closed as accidental death due to thermal burn injuries and drowning. No criminal investigation was initiated. Ranger Whitmore's body was cremated per his family's wishes. The 2009 incident report was almost entirely redacted, except for one crucial line: multiple reports of unauthorized personnel in ranger uniform observed on trail during June-September period. Individuals could not be identified or contacted. No explanation found for incidents. Recommend immediate closure to prevent further safety concerns. I stared at the documents in my hotel room, the pieces falling into place in my mind, each one worse than the last. Something wearing Ranger Whitmore's uniform, or the appearance of it, following hikers, trying to lead them deeper. The bones in the hot spring marked the spot where he died. The burial site I'd found near mile marker 1 had been in use for something else, something more recent. I had gone to investigate a closed trail and found evidence of murders. Evidence that someone or something was using a dead ranger's identity to hunt people in the Yellowstone backcountry. Evidence that the Park Service knew this and simply closed the trail instead of investigating. The satellite communicator in my bag had GPS logging. All my photos were time-stamped. Everything I documented on that trail existed, verifiable and damning. I should have filed a report. I should have taken it to the authorities, to journalists, to someone with power. Instead, I did what survival instinct demanded. I drove to a motel in West Yellowstone, packed my belongings, and was on Interstate 90 heading toward Bozeman by nightfall. I took a flight from Bozeman to Denver the next morning, and from Denver to my home in Boulder. I quit the graduate program by email, forfeited my grant, and told no one, not the university, not the Park Service, not law enforcement, what I had found. For 3 years, I told myself it was the right decision. I told myself the Park Service had its reasons for keeping it contained. I told myself there was nothing I could do that wouldn't either be ignored or get me disappeared. But I've never forgotten the sound of those footsteps, the way they'd stopped when I called out, the way they'd resumed, walking away, as if whatever made that sound had made a choice. And I've never stopped thinking about that burial site near mile marker 1, and the question of what was buried there before I found the bones in the water. Last month, I received a postcard in the mail. No return address. The front was an old photograph of Ridgeline Trail, dated 1987, showing a ranger in uniform standing at the trailhead. His name tag was too small to read, but his posture was careful, his expression composed. On the back, in handwriting that looked like it had been written with deliberate pressure, was a single sentence: "The trail remembers everyone who walks it." I didn't recognize the handwriting. I didn't recognize the ranger's face, though something in his composition seemed achingly familiar. The postcard is sitting on my desk as I write this. I've moved 3 times since finding it, but I always pack it carefully. I sometimes wonder if moving was pointless. If something that can wear a uniform from 1987 can send postcards from anywhere, then distance probably doesn't matter. The Ridgeline Trail closure has been extended twice since 2009. The most recent official notice, filed in 2023, states the trail will remain closed indefinitely due to ongoing geological assessment and wildlife habitat protection. No new information has been released, but I check the Park Service website sometimes, and I've noticed something curious. In the last 4 years, the missing persons reports from Yellowstone have started to include people who were hiking trails nowhere near Ridgeline. Trails that were open, trails that tourists used every day. The names get added to the database. Investigations are opened. Search and rescue teams go out. And usually, after several weeks or months, the cases are closed due to inconclusive evidence or tragic accidents involving thermal features or falls. The Park Service maintains that these incidents are unrelated. They maintain that Yellowstone is safe if you respect the trails and follow the rules. But I know now that Ridgeline Trail was never closed because of what happened there. It was closed because of what never left. Before we begin, understand that this is an original work of fictional horror told in a documentary style. Black Pine National Forest, Sector 6, and every agency, document, recording, scientist, journalist, ranger, location, and event in this story are fictional. Any resemblance to real people, places, institutions, or incidents is coincidental, and any case files, news reports, radio transmissions, maps, or official-looking materials shown with the video are dramatized elements created for entertainment. Between 2019 and 2021, 14 closure notices appeared across a remote section of Black Pine National Forest. The public explanations were ordinary. One road was closed because of erosion. 2 trails were restricted for habitat restoration. A campground was shut down during a wildlife survey. Several backcountry zones were marked unsafe after a geological assessment. Viewed separately, none of those notices appeared unusual. Viewed together on a map, they formed a rough circle around the same point beneath Sector 6. No ranger involved in the first discovery spoke publicly while employed by the Federal Forestry Bureau. The internal case file was fragmented. Several pages disappeared after being submitted. Technical reports were rewritten in language so vague that they explained almost nothing. One witness account survived, only because its author kept a private copy outside the agency archive. What follows is the reconstructed account of what happened in Black Pine Sector 6. Black Pine National Forest covered more than 1 million acres in the northwestern state of Gray Pine. Most visitors knew it for old cedar groves, cold mountain lakes, and long trails that disappeared into the Rain Shadow Range. The public maps showed campgrounds, ranger stations, fire roads, and marked wilderness routes. The internal maps showed something else. Beneath the eastern half of the forest was an extensive system of caves, water channels, and hollow limestone chambers. Some had been surveyed in the 1970s. Others had appeared only as blank areas in ground-penetrating scans. The largest of those blank areas lay under Sector 6. In November 2018, Senior Ranger Elias Mercer was reassigned to oversee maintenance operations there. Mercer had worked for the Federal Forestry Bureau for 23 years. He had managed wildfire crews, coordinated missing person searches, trained new rangers, and spent enough nights alone in the backcountry to know the difference between fear and imagination. His colleagues described him as patient, skeptical, and almost painfully methodical. He documented damaged signs, broken bridge boards, low fuel in emergency caches, and radio interference that most rangers would have ignored. He did not believe in monsters, secret facilities, or supernatural warnings. He believed in weather, terrain, bad judgment, and the dangerous confidence of inexperienced visitors. That was why his first report from Sector 6 attracted attention. On November 18, Mercer and two junior rangers, Jonah Reed and Lena Ortiz, were inspecting an old fire road northeast of Crowglass Ridge. The road had been built above the surrounding forest floor on a compacted bed of stone and gravel. It had remained stable for decades. When the three rangers reached mile marker 12, they found a section of asphalt, nearly 100 feet long, sinking into the ground. It had not cracked like a road damaged by frost. It had not washed away from rain. The entire surface had lowered in one broad depression. In some places, the asphalt sat 18 inches below its original level. Near the center, it had dropped almost 3 feet. Reed suggested an underground washout. Ortiz thought a hidden cavern had collapsed. Mercer agreed that either explanation was possible, but the shape bothered him. The edges of the depression were too smooth. The center was too regular. It looked less like the ground had failed, and more like something below had pulled away from the road. Mercer closed the section to vehicles and submitted a geological assessment request. He expected a response within several days. No geologist arrived for nearly 3 weeks. During that delay, the road continued to sink. Mercer measured it every morning. The change was small but consistent. A 1/4 inch one day, 1/2 inch the next. The asphalt did not break apart. It lowered as a single sheet, bending gradually toward the center. At the same time, Mercer began hearing a burst of static on the internal ranger channel. It occurred every evening at exactly 8:47. The sound lasted 4 seconds. It was not random interference. It began sharply, held at the same intensity, and ended without fading. Mercer changed batteries. He tested a second radio. He checked the repeater station and asked other rangers whether they had noticed the signal. Reed had heard it twice. Ortiz had heard it every night since the road survey. Mercer logged the anomaly, but did not connect it to the sinking road. Not yet. 2 days before Christmas, Dr. Mara Voss arrived from the Bureau's Geological Division. She specialized in karst terrain, underground water systems, and unstable cave networks. She had evaluated dozens of sinkholes and road collapses. According to Mercer's private notes, she became uneasy within the first hour. Voss took soil samples from both sides of the road. She measured moisture levels and lowered narrow probes into the soft ground near the depression. She collected water from a new seep that had appeared beside the asphalt. Then she asked Mercer to walk with her away from Reed and Ortiz. Her first question was not about the road. She asked whether he had heard anything unusual on the radio. Mercer told her about the 8:47 signal. Voss looked back toward the depression and asked whether the timing had changed. When he said no, she told him to keep recording it, but not to discuss it over an open channel. Mercer asked what she had found. Voss said the ground beneath the road contained a cavity much larger than any mapped cave in that sector. The seepage pattern suggested water had recently been displaced from below. The soil was not collapsing inward in the normal way. Pressure under the road had changed. Then she used the sentence Mercer would later repeat more than any other. "Whatever is down there," she said, "the space is not empty anymore. Something filled it, or something moved inside it." Her official report did not contain that sentence. The report recommended closing the road and conducting a controlled drilling operation. The purpose, according to the document, was to determine the depth of the cavity and identify the material forming its lower boundary. Approval came unusually fast. Regional Director Owen Vale authorized the drilling in early January, but the operation came with restrictions. It had to occur during a period of low ranger traffic. Only Mercer, Voss, the contractor, and Mercer's district supervisor were allowed at the site. All samples were to be transferred directly to the regional office. No photographs were to be taken unless Voss approved them. The drilling crew arrived on January 28, 2019. The plan was simple. The drill would pass through the asphalt, soil, and loose stone, then enter the underground cavity. A hollow sampling probe would collect material from the bottom. Based on the available geological maps, the crew expected to encounter bedrock at approximately 80 feet. For the first 37 feet, everything went normally. Then the drill struck something hard. The resistance was sudden enough to shake the rig. The sound was not the blunt grinding of stone. Mercer described it as high, metallic, and layered, as though the bit were scraping across ceramic plates beneath the soil. The crew supervisor withdrew the drill. The bit was undamaged, but a brown granular substance coated its lower edge. Under direct light, the grains reflected faint colors that did not match any common mineral Mercer recognized. Voss sealed the material in a containment bag. She did not answer when Mercer asked what it was. The drilling resumed at reduced speed. At 52 feet, the bit struck the same material. This time it took more than an hour to pass through. At 68 feet, the drill entered open space. The cavity beneath the road was deeper than expected. A camera line was prepared, but Voss stopped the crew before it could be lowered. She received a call from the regional office, walked away from the site, and returned 10 minutes later with new instructions. No camera would be used. Only a sealed sampling probe was authorized. The probe was lowered on the second morning. The operation should have taken 30 minutes. It took 4 hours. Each time the crew tried to raise the probe, the cable tightened, as though something below had caught it. The winch strained, then released. The probe rose several feet, stopped, and sank again. Voss remained on the radio with the operator. Mercer heard her ask the same question repeatedly. "Is it moving?" The operator said he could not tell. "Do not estimate," Voss replied. "Tell me if the resistance changes position." At 1:13 in the afternoon, the probe came free. Its steel housing was scratched from end to end. The marks ran in parallel groups of 3 and 4. The lower compartment contained black dust, brown crystalline grains, and a thin gray material that resembled ash but clung to the metal like damp skin. No one at the site touched it with bare hands. That evening, District Supervisor Mara Holt ordered Mercer to prepare a complete written account. He produced 17 pages describing the drill resistance, the radio interference, the damaged probe, the sample, and Voss's repeated question about movement. The following morning, Holt returned the report with 4 sections marked for removal. The crystalline material was to be described only as an unidentified mineral deposit. The damaged probe was to be omitted. Voss's questions were to be removed. The crew member who had requested to leave because of safety concerns was not to be mentioned. Mercer asked why. Holt said the technical details would be handled in a separate restricted file. She told him that unverified language could create confusion if the report became public. Mercer objected that the details were observations, not theories. Holt lowered her voice and told him the decision had not come from her. Within a week, the road was barricaded. The public closure notice cited subsurface instability and ongoing geological assessment. The drilling equipment disappeared overnight. Mercer never learned where the samples were taken. For the next 3 months, Sector 6 appeared quiet. Then the broader survey began. Ground-penetrating radar teams established a grid across 7 square miles. They worked from dawn until dusk, placing sensors at regular intervals and marking coordinates with small metal stakes. Mercer was deliberately assigned to other sectors during the survey, but he could see the pattern on the internal scheduling maps. The teams were not searching for random sinkholes. They were tracing the outline of one connected underground space. In June, a group of 12 hikers, led by outdoor educator Hannah Pierce, entered the Alder Run Trail. Pierce had guided the route more than 30 times. 4 miles in, she noticed an unusual division in the forest canopy. On one side of the trail, the trees were mature and evenly spaced. On the other, younger trees formed a near-perfect half-circle. There was no evidence of logging or fire. The boundary was too precise to be natural. Pierce measured the formation. The circle was approximately 340 feet across. Tree ring samples suggested that seedlings inside the shape had stopped growing at the same time roughly 70 years earlier. Decades later, growth had resumed. Pierce filed a courtesy report with the local ranger station. 2 days later, Alder Run Trail was closed for maintenance, despite having no visible damage. By August, 4 separate closure zones covered Sector 6 and part of the neighboring sector. Their boundaries followed the underground radar grid. Mercer was now working 75 miles away, but the 8:47 radio burst followed him. At first, he thought the interference was coming through the Bureau's central network. Then he borrowed an old analog receiver that was not connected to the ranger system. At exactly 8:47, the same 4-second signal came through. This time, he recorded it. When played at normal speed, it sounded like static. When slowed, a low pulse appeared beneath the noise. The pulse repeated at regular intervals. Mercer could not identify it as speech, but it was too structured to be random. He requested a permanent transfer out of Sector 6. It was approved within 3 days. That should have ended his involvement. It did not. In September, the geological survey was completed. The final report was divided into 2 versions. The public version described unstable soil, unusual mineral formations, and a need for long-term habitat protection. The restricted version was never released. 2 weeks later, Regional Director Vail closed the entire sector. Nearly 70,000 acres of public land became inaccessible. Hiking trails, campsites, fishing areas, and scenic roads were blocked. Local businesses were told the closure would last several years. No restoration crews arrived. No public construction began. The perimeter was simply guarded. Residents protested. Outdoor groups demanded maps and timelines. The Bureau repeated the same statement. The closure was necessary for environmental safety. Then the humming began. The first formal report came from Ranger Iris Cole in Sector 7. During a patrol shortly before sunrise, she felt a vibration through the soles of her boots. It was too steady to be an earthquake, and too low to be heard clearly. She followed it to a ridge overlooking the closed zone. The sound came from underground. Cole recorded 9 minutes on a handheld device. In her written report, she said the pulse changed when she moved. When she walked north, the frequency increased. When she stopped, it settled. When she spoke into the darkness, the vibration paused. Her report disappeared from the internal system within 48 hours. 3 weeks later, Cole was dismissed for violating documentation protocol and entering an unauthorized area. Other rangers understood the message. They continued hearing the humming, but they stopped filing reports. Mercer learned about the incidents through private conversations. Rangers from Sectors 4, 5, and 7 described the same early morning vibration. Several reported compass failures near the perimeter. 2 said their radios transmitted voices that sounded like fellow rangers who were not on duty. 1 ranger heard his own call sign repeated from inside the closed forest. In 2020, the Bureau increased patrols and instructed staff not to discuss unexplained acoustic events. New signs appeared along the boundary. They did not mention habitat restoration. They said entry posed an immediate safety risk and could result in arrest. Mercer became convinced the closure had nothing to do with ordinary geology. He knew something solid had been found beneath the road. He knew the probe had returned with intentional-looking scratches. He knew the underground space extended far beyond the original depression. He knew the Bureau was monitoring a vibration that seemed responsive to movement and sound. What he did not know was whether the buried structure had been discovered or awakened. By mid-2021, Mercer had stopped sleeping through the night. The radio burst came at 8:47 even when every device in his house was turned off. Sometimes he woke seconds before it began, already listening. He took extended leave. In September, after 23 years of service, he resigned. His letter gave no reason beyond personal health and family priorities. His departure was approved without an exit interview. He received a separation package larger than expected and a written reminder that restricted operational information remained confidential. For almost 2 years, Mercer said nothing. He moved to a small town in the neighboring state of Westmere and worked private security. He avoided forests. He kept his old radio locked in a cabinet. At 8:47 each evening, he could still hear a faint hiss from behind the cabinet door. What happened after Mercer resigned made the silence surrounding Sector 6 even harder to explain. After Mercer's resignation, the Bureau maintained the Sector 6 closure. The official explanation remained unchanged: habitat restoration, geological assessment, no reopening date. The phenomenon beneath the forest did change. By early 2022, residents of Greyhaven, 18 miles south of the boundary, began reporting weak tremors during the early morning hours. The vibrations did not rattle windows or damage buildings. They moved through floors and foundations as a steady pressure, lasting between 30 seconds and several minutes. A National Seismic Institute station in Stonewater detected the events. They were too organized to resemble ordinary earthquakes. Each began with a gradual rise, held at a stable frequency, and ended sharply. Dr. Caleb Morrison, a seismologist assigned to review the records, compared the pattern to large machinery operating underground. There was no mine, drilling project, or geothermal facility in Sector 6. Morrison requested access to data collected by the Federal Forestry Bureau. His request was denied. His supervisor told him the matter had been elevated beyond his clearance and advised him to stop asking questions. The same barriers appeared in academic research. Dr. Elise Warren of Cascadia State University submitted a proposal to study cave systems near the closed zone. The Bureau rejected it. She revised the proposal to focus only on land outside the boundary. It was rejected again. A third request involving soil samples from public trails was denied without explanation. The restrictions attracted the attention of investigative journalist Daniel Cross. Cross worked for the Northwest Independent Ledger, a small publication known for long-form investigations into institutional secrecy. He began with public records requests. The Bureau delayed its response, then released closure notices with most technical attachments removed. Cross contacted former employees. Most refused to speak. One anonymous source confirmed that habitat restoration was a cover explanation, and that the original road collapse had exposed something the agency had encountered before. That last detail changed the investigation. Cross searched archived geological records from the 1970s and 1980s. Several surveys referred to anomalous subsurface features in what would later become Sector 6. The digital copies contained handwritten notes that were difficult to read. When Cross requested the original paper files, the Bureau said they could not be located. A retired administrator named Helen Marrow remembered them. Marrow had worked in the regional office during the 1980s. In a recorded interview, she described an incident that had never appeared in the public archive. Erosion had exposed part of an underground formation in Sector 6. A field team initially believed it was a natural wall. Closer inspection revealed straight edges, repeating geometric recesses, and a surface that did not match the surrounding rock. The team requested excavation equipment. Regional management denied the request. The exposed section was covered, the access road was removed from public maps, and the area was quietly designated for limited use. Marrow said the decision was motivated by fear of public attention. No one knew what the structure was, how old it might be, or whether it extended deeper beneath the forest. The simplest response was to bury it again. In 2019, the sinking road had exposed the same underground zone. Cross published his first article in March 2022. He carefully labeled every uncertain claim as an allegation and every document as unverified. The article asked a simple question: why had the Bureau closed an enormous public area without releasing the geological evidence that supposedly justified it? The Bureau denied discovering any artificial structure. Officials said natural crystalline formations could appear geometric to untrained observers. 1 month later, a package arrived at the Ledger office. It contained pages that appeared to come from Dr. Voss's 2019 report, and their contents transformed the case. The report described a structured formation of non-natural origin. It referred to geometric components arranged in repeating intervals and a material composition inconsistent with the surrounding geological period. One paragraph stated that the underground formation displayed features associated with intentional construction. Another described ongoing mechanical or biological activity inside or adjacent to the structure. The report did not explain what that activity was. The most important pages were missing. Cross published the documents while emphasizing that their authenticity could not be independently verified. The Bureau first called them fabricated. Independent document specialists said the paper, seals, and signatures appeared consistent with agency records. The Bureau then changed its position. Officials claimed the pages had been taken out of context and that Voss had used technical language to describe unusual but natural rock. That explanation did not account for the damaged probe, the suppressed Ranger recordings, the previous discovery in the 1980s, or the continuing vibrations. In June 2022, Elias Mercer contacted Cross. Mercer agreed to an interview because he believed the public version of events had become more misleading than the truth. He brought his private notes, a copy of his original 17-page report, and photographs he had never submitted to the Central Archive. The photographs showed the sinking road several days after the drilling operation. The depression had changed. Its edges were no longer irregular. The asphalt had settled into a near-perfect oval. Across the lowest point were parallel marks, each several feet long. The grooves were too evenly spaced to have been made by falling rock. They appeared to have been cut from below. Mercer said he had shown the images to Supervisor Holt. She stared at them for several minutes, then asked whether anyone else had copies. When Mercer said no, she told him to delete them. He pretended to comply. Mercer also revealed that he had returned to the site alone after the official closure. He went at dawn, when patrol activity was lowest. The barricades were in place, but the road beyond them had sunk another 2 feet. Standing at the edge, he heard a faint tapping beneath the asphalt. 3 taps, a pause, 3 taps, a longer pause, then 4 taps. Mercer struck the road surface once with the metal end of his flashlight. The tapping stopped. Several seconds later, 1 tap answered from below. He left immediately. Cross published Mercer's account over several weeks. Public interest intensified. News programs debated whether the structure was an archaeological discovery, an abandoned military installation, an unknown geological formation, or an elaborate misunderstanding. The Bureau announced an independent scientific review. The 7-member panel included geologists, engineers, acoustic specialists, and environmental scientists. 4 had previous contracts with the Bureau. 2 were employed by institutions receiving federal funding. Only 1, Dr. Naomi Wren, had no direct connection to the agency. Wren requested access to Sector 6. The request was denied for safety reasons. She requested raw seismic records. She received summaries. She requested the complete 2019 report. She received a version missing 14 pages. Even so, Wren noticed something significant. The vibrations had stopped in August 2022, shortly after the panel was announced. The Bureau presented the silence as evidence that the geological event had stabilized. Wren disagreed. If the phenomenon were mechanical, something had stopped the machinery. If it were biological, something had become inactive. If it were communicative, something had chosen to stop signaling. Dr. Morrison privately reviewed the data with her. He found the final recorded sequence unlike the earlier vibrations. The pulses shortened over several hours, repeating in groups that suggested a countdown or closing pattern. The panel's final report was released in November. It concluded that unusual subsurface formations existed, that the closure should continue, and that further study was required. It did not address artificial construction, responsive vibration, or intentional movement. Cross called it a report designed to preserve secrecy while giving secrecy a scientific appearance. Then another source came forward, The source claimed to have worked with the 2019 drilling crew. According to this account, the probe had not become caught on rock. Something inside the cavity had gripped it. The crew felt tension change in deliberate steps. When they pulled upward, the resistance increased. When they lowered the cable, the resistance relaxed. The probe was released only after Voss instructed the operator to stop the winch and wait in silence. The source also described a sound that traveled through the cable. It was not scraping. It resembled a low vibration shaped into repeated tones. Voss believed the underground structure was occupied. The years of humming were not random movement. They were attempts to communicate through the soil. That interpretation explained why the signal reacted to ranger footsteps, voices, and equipment. It also explained why the Bureau had become more afraid after the vibrations stopped. A signal could fail, or the sender could decide it was no longer necessary. In 2023, Sector 6 remained closed. Visitors approaching the perimeter were turned away. Rangers patrolled in pairs. Acoustic sensors and ground monitors appeared along the boundary. The public gradually lost interest. The forest did not. Residents of Greyhaven still reported early morning tremors. Dogs refused to face north during them. Birds left certain areas of the forest before the ground began to hum. In September, a hiker on a legal trail recorded a low sound beneath a bridge. When he spoke, the vibration paused. When he said hello a second time, 3 clear pulses answered from underground. The Bureau called it water movement. The bridge was removed the following week. Then, in March 2024, the situation changed again. A directive circulated inside the Federal Forestry Bureau, authorizing an immediate expansion of the Sector 6 closure. Parts of Sectors 5 and 7 were added to the restricted zone. The public notice again cited habitat restoration and geological assessment. The restricted version gave a different reason. Seismic monitors had detected activity beyond the original underground boundary. The new signals did not radiate outward like ordinary tremors. They appeared at separate points, one after another, as if something beneath the forest were moving through connected chambers. The directive authorized additional ground radar, acoustic arrays, thermal sensors, and 24-hour patrols. It also included a contingency clause. If the activity crossed a specified threshold, the Bureau could request assistance from the National Defense Office. Daniel Cross received a copy from an anonymous Bureau employee. He published the directive while emphasizing that the document could not be independently verified. The Bureau launched an internal investigation. Employees were warned that releasing restricted material could lead to dismissal and prosecution under a national security statute. The closure continued to expand. Public trails near Sector 6 were blocked. 2 campgrounds were permanently removed from reservation systems. Rangers were placed at access roads. Visitors who asked for a detailed explanation received printed notices containing the same sentence. Conditions within the restricted area presented an unpredictable risk to public safety. Independent journalist Leah Monroe decided to observe the boundary without crossing it. In July 2024, she hiked to a legal overlook in Sector 7, approximately 100 yards outside the closure line. She carried audio recorders, cameras, a thermal scope, and a directional microphone. She remained there for 3 days. The first night was quiet until 2:16 in the morning. Monroe recorded a low mechanical hum beneath the sound of insects. A second layer entered several seconds later. It resembled an animal call, but held one note too steadily. A third sound rose beneath both, too deep for her microphone to capture cleanly. When Monroe shifted her tripod, the humming stopped. She whispered that the sound had ended. A tone answered from inside the restricted forest. Monroe remained silent for 2 minutes. Nothing happened. Then she said her own name. 3 tones responded. Short, long, short. She repeated the name. The pattern repeated exactly. On the second night, Monroe moved 50 yards along the boundary. The sound followed. It did not grow louder or quieter, according to her distance from the original source. It seemed to relocate beneath her position. She tested it carefully. She walked east. The signal moved east. She returned west. The signal returned beneath her. At one point, she knocked twice on a tree trunk. 2 knocks came from below the ground. Monroe's video showed no creature, machine, or person. It showed only a forest that looked subtly wrong. Inside the closure, the canopy appeared darker, even when the surrounding trees were illuminated by moonlight. The undergrowth rose in broad ridges, as though pressure from below had lifted the soil without breaking it. On the 3rd morning, Monroe saw movement near the base of a cedar. The earth shifted upward by several inches, traveled in a straight line for approximately 20 feet, and settled again. Roots flexed as the movement passed beneath them. Monroe packed her equipment and left. She published 12 hours of audio and several short video clips. Researchers examined the sound patterns and reached no agreement. Wildlife specialists identified fragments resembling elk, owl, and human vocal ranges, but no known animal produced all of them. Acoustic engineers found repeated intervals that appeared organized. Several linguists cautioned that humans naturally perceive language in random noise. Dr. Naomi Wren performed a more detailed analysis. Her paper, published in the Cascadian Journal of Acoustic Studies, did not claim that the sounds were language. It stated that the recordings contained repetition, variation, turn-taking behavior, and apparent responses to external stimuli. Those features justified controlled investigation. The Department of Public Lands dismissed the conclusion as speculative. Wren responded that speculation was exactly what secrecy produced. Without transparent access to raw data, independent scientists could neither prove nor disprove the Bureau's claims. Then, a ranger disappeared. Thomas Bell had worked in Black Pine for 12 years. He was reliable, experienced, and known for checking in early rather than late. On September 4, he began a routine patrol along the Sector 4 boundary. His first radio transmission was ordinary. His second was not. Dispatch heard Bell breathing heavily. He said he had found tracks near the boundary, but did not describe them. After a long pause, he whispered, "There is something walking under me." The dispatcher asked him to repeat the message. Bell returned to his formal radio voice, beginning perimeter patrol. Sector 4 boundary. That was his final confirmed transmission. Search teams entered the legal patrol area within an hour. A helicopter scanned the canopy. Tracking dogs were brought to Bell's last known position. The dogs followed his scent to the closure line and stopped. They would not cross. No footprints continued beyond the marker. No equipment was found. Bell's emergency beacon never activated. His radio produced no signal. 3 days later, a small package appeared outside the regional office. It contained Bell's identification badge and radio. The badge had been cleaned. The radio was packed with damp soil, but its exterior was undamaged. Security cameras showed the entrance throughout the night. No person delivered the package. Technicians recovered 11 seconds of audio from the radio memory. Bell's voice said, "I am at the boundary." A second voice repeated the sentence. It sounded almost identical to Bell, but the timing was wrong. The words overlapped before he finished speaking, as though the second voice knew the sentence before he said it. The final sound was a low pulse matching Monroe's recordings. The Bureau attributed Bell's disappearance to an accident in difficult terrain. His body was never found. Rangers near Sector 6 reacted immediately. Several requested transfers. Patrols changed from single ranger assignments to teams of 2. Each team carried redundant radios, satellite beacons, and mechanical whistles that could be heard if electronic equipment failed. The Bureau also introduced a rule that no ranger was to respond to a voice coming from beyond the boundary unless the speaker was visually confirmed. That rule was never included in public safety notices. In October, selected federal oversight officials received a closed briefing. Soon afterward, lawmakers approved a large emergency allocation for enhanced geological monitoring and environmental security at Black Pine. The amount exceeded what ordinary seismic sensors would require. By January 2025, satellite images showed a rectangular clearing inside Sector 6. It had not existed the previous summer. The clearing was more than 200 feet across. Its edges were unnaturally straight. Several temporary structures stood around a dark central area. The Bureau said the image resolution was too poor to interpret, and repeated that restoration work was underway. No access road led to the clearing. Residents of Greyhaven reported heavy aircraft flying north at night. Truck convoys traveled toward closed service roads before dawn. Bureau employees described specialized drilling equipment, power generators, and mobile communication units, though none of those reports could be confirmed. Then the vibrations stopped again. The silence lasted 11 weeks. During that period, animal behavior around the boundary changed. Deer abandoned feeding grounds they had used for years. Birds left the northern forest several minutes before sunrise and returned after dark. Hikers with dogs reported that the animals became distressed near specific trail markers. One wildlife team placed motion cameras outside the closure. The cameras recorded animals moving normally until 3:12 one morning. Every visible animal turned toward Sector 6 at the same moment. For 20 seconds, nothing moved. Then all of them ran in the opposite direction. The cameras lost power immediately afterward. In April, the ground beneath the rectangular clearing rose. This event was not visible to the public, but a thermal satellite recorded a warm shape expanding below the surface. The heat signature was oval and approximately 400 feet long. It remained for 6 minutes, then separated into several smaller shapes, moving away from the center. The next public closure added another 8,000 acres. Cross continued publishing updates, but his tone changed. He stopped describing the underground presence as trapped. He began referring to it as distributed. Mercer read every article. In late January 2025, he died from a documented medical event at the age of 58. There was no evidence that his death resulted from foul play. Cross said speculation without evidence would disrespect the man who had insisted on careful documentation. Mercer's personal effects included the old analog radio he had kept locked in a cabinet. According to his family, the radio had no batteries. At 8:47 on the evening after his funeral, it produced 4 seconds of static. Then, it spoke in Mercer's voice. "Do not answer from below." The family destroyed the radio. By the summer of 2025, Sector 6 had become a permanent feature of local life. The unaffected forest remained open. Visitors hiked, camped, and photographed the mountains. Most accepted the restricted zone, as they would accept a military range or unstable wilderness area. People living near the boundary treated it differently. They learned not to investigate humming sounds before sunrise. They kept pets indoors when the ground vibrated. They avoided roads where navigation systems briefly displayed routes that no longer existed. Several residents reported receiving phone calls from disconnected numbers. The caller said nothing at first. After several seconds, it repeated a phrase the recipient had spoken earlier that day. The calls ended when the recipient asked who was speaking. Cross collected the reports but could not verify them. He refused to publish names or addresses. In March 2026, he received an email from someone claiming to be Dr. Mara Voss. The message contained no attachment and no proof of identity. It consisted of 6 sentences. "I remained silent because the first containment plan required silence. The drilling did not open the structure. It informed the structure that the surface was occupied. The vibrations were not requests for release. They were measurements. It has been learning distance, voice, movement, and response. If the signals begin again, do not answer them." Cross replied immediately. The address no longer existed. He compared the language with Voss's earlier reports and found several matching phrases, but he could not confirm who had sent the message. 2 weeks later, the signals returned. Every seismic monitor around Blackpine detected the same pulse at 8:47 p.m. Unlike the earlier localized events, this signal appeared simultaneously beneath all 7 forest sectors. It lasted 4 seconds. The following night, it happened again. On the third night, ranger radios across the forest activated without being keyed. The transmission began as static. Then a calm voice spoke each ranger's call sign. Some heard a male voice. Some heard a female voice. Several heard deceased relatives. One heard Thomas Bell. The Bureau ordered all radios switched off. At 8:47, the voices continued through powered-down speakers. Emergency teams withdrew from the interior. Roads were blocked at the forest boundary. The public was told a severe communications failure had affected safety systems. Dr. Wren received a copy of the raw transmission. She compared it with Monroe's 2024 recordings and found the same intervals. This time, however, the pattern was simpler. It repeated in groups of 5 tones. Wren converted the intervals into the response system used during earlier acoustic tests. The result was not a translation. It was a correspondence. The underground signal had copied the rhythm humans used when asking a question and waiting for an answer. The next night, Cross drove to the public overlook outside Sector 7. He did not cross the boundary. He carried no recording equipment. He wanted to hear the signal without microphones, filters, or other people's interpretations. At 8:47, the forest became silent. The ground beneath the overlook vibrated once. Cross felt the pulse rise through his shoes and into his chest. A voice came from the trees. It sounded like Elias Mercer. "Daniel," it said. Cross did not answer. The voice moved closer without footsteps. "Daniel Cross." He remained silent. The soil on the other side of the boundary lifted in a narrow line. The movement traveled between the trees and stopped beneath the warning sign. Then a different voice spoke. This one sounded like Dr. Voss. "It knows you are listening." Cross backed away. The sign at the boundary began to tremble. Soil cracked around its posts. For a moment, the earth beneath it appeared hollow. From inside that hollow came dozens of voices speaking at once. Rangers, journalists, scientists, children, men and women Cross did not recognize. They did not scream. They repeated fragments of questions that people had asked near Sector 6 over the previous 7 years. "What is down there? Can you hear me? Is it moving? Who are you? What do you want?" The voices stopped. One final sentence rose through the ground in Cross's own voice. "What would make you open the boundary?" Cross ran to his vehicle and left. He published no article about the encounter. Instead, he delivered his files to several independent archives and withdrew from public reporting. The Federal Forestry Bureau expanded the closure for the final time. The public explanation cited a long-term geological hazard. The boundary now surrounded every location where responsive signals had been recorded. The humming decreased after that. It never disappeared completely. In the final case notes, hikers on open trails still describe 4 seconds of static at 8:47. Compasses turn north toward Sector 6, regardless of direction. Phones briefly display an unnamed road leading into the closed zone. No road exists when visitors look up from the screen. The fate of Thomas Bell remains unknown. Dr. Voss is never publicly located. Dr. Wren continues studying acoustic patterns, but refuses to listen to the recordings alone. Daniel Cross no longer answers calls from numbers he does not recognize. Black Pine National Forest remains open outside the restricted sectors. Families visit the lakes. Campers sleep under cedar trees. Rangers explain that the distant fences protect visitors from unstable ground. Most people accept that answer. The people who worked the Sector 6 boundary do not. They believe the authorities closed the forest for one of 2 reasons. Either they were protecting the public from something beneath the soil, or they were protecting the underground presence from the public. The distinction mattered less with every passing year, because whatever occupied the buried structure was no longer simply moving below Sector 6. It was studying voices. It was measuring distance. It was learning which names made people stop, which memories made them answer, and which questions made them come closer. The drilling operation had not released it. The drilling operation had introduced us. And somewhere beneath Black Pine, beyond the closed roads and silent monitoring stations, something continued repeating the first human question it had learned well enough to understand. "Can you hear me?" The forest remained closed. The warning signs remained in place, and for the moment, No one answered. The following continuation is an original work of fictional horror, presented in a documentary style. Black Pine National Forest, the Federal Forestry Bureau, Sector 6, and every character, agency, recording, document, and event described in this story are fictional and created solely for entertainment. For 3 months after Daniel Cross left the Sector 7 overlook, Black Pine National Forest remained quiet. There were no new vibrations beneath the closed sectors, no ranger radios activated by themselves. No residents reported hearing familiar voices in the woods. The 4-second burst of static that had appeared at 8:47 every evening for nearly 7 years stopped completely. The Federal Forestry Bureau treated the silence as evidence that the final expansion of the restricted zone had worked. Public statements described the containment measures as successful. Several temporary checkpoints were removed from roads outside the closure. Rangers who had been reassigned to distant districts began returning to ordinary patrol duties. The scientific personnel stationed at the Emergency Monitoring Center were reduced from 42 people to 11. No one used the word victory, but that was how the Bureau behaved. Dr. Naomi Wren did not share their confidence. She had spent more time studying the Black Pine recordings than any person still willing to discuss them. She knew the difference between the absence of activity and the absence of communication. Before the signals stopped, the underground presence had learned how humans asked questions. It had learned names, voices, emotional responses, and the value of silence. It had demonstrated that it could activate equipment without electricity and reproduce sounds spoken miles away. Wren believed that something capable of learning silence could also choose to use it. She continued analyzing the recordings from her private laboratory at Gray Pine Institute. She no longer listened through headphones. She played the files through speakers positioned at the opposite end of the room, and she never worked alone after sunset. Each evening, she disconnected every microphone, covered the small camera above her computer, and removed the batteries from the portable recorder she carried during field investigations. At 8:47, she stopped whatever she was doing and waited. Nothing happened. That silence continued until the night of September 18, 2026. Wren was reviewing seismic data from a location more than 200 miles east of Black Pine when the analog telephone on her desk rang. The telephone had no digital display and no connection to the Institute's internal network. She kept it because she believed old technology was easier to understand and therefore easier to trust. The caller identification system in the Institute's exchange listed the source as an internal extension. The extension belonged to a laboratory that had been demolished 12 years earlier. Wren allowed the telephone to ring 6 times before answering. She did not speak. She lifted the receiver and held it several inches from her ear. At first, she heard only faint static. Then a man began breathing. The breaths were slow, shallow, and uneven. Between them came a distant metallic sound, as if something heavy were dragging across stone. Wren listened for 23 seconds. The man whispered her name. Naomi. She recognized the voice from the Ranger dispatch recordings. It belonged to Thomas Bell. Bell had disappeared during a perimeter patrol 2 years earlier. His identification badge and radio had been returned to the regional office in a package that appeared outside the building without being captured by security cameras. Search teams found no trace of his body, clothing, or equipment. His case remained officially classified as an unresolved wilderness disappearance. Wren gripped the receiver but did not answer. Bell's voice spoke again. "I can hear you not speaking." A low vibration traveled through the telephone line. It was too deep to be produced by the small receiver, but Wren felt it through the plastic against her hand. Bell continued. "They think the quiet means it went back to sleep." He paused. "It has never slept." Something struck metal in the background. Bell inhaled sharply. Then he said, "Do not let them remove the casing." The call ended. Wren remained seated with the receiver in her hand. She checked the wall clock. It was 8:47. The Institute's telecommunications department found no record of an incoming call. The internal exchange had not routed anything to Wren's office. The demolished laboratory extension had not existed in the system for more than a decade. Technicians inspected the analog line and found no malfunction. Wren did not tell them what she had heard. The next morning, she contacted Daniel Cross. Cross had withdrawn from investigative reporting after his encounter at the Sector 7 boundary. He had left his apartment in the capital, canceled his public telephone number, and transferred his files to several independent archives. He lived in a small house near the town of Hollow Creek, under an address that did not appear in any public directory. Wren sent a letter rather than calling. It contained 4 words. Bell called last night. Cross arrived at Grey Pine Institute 2 days later. He looked older than Wren remembered. His hair had begun turning gray near the temples, and he repeatedly checked the windows while they spoke. He carried no mobile telephone. He had removed the navigation system from his vehicle and replaced it with a paper road atlas. Wren told him about the call. Cross did not question whether it had happened. He asked only what Bell had said. When Wren repeated the warning about removing the casing, Cross became still. 3 weeks earlier, an anonymous source inside the Federal Forestry Bureau had mailed him several pages from a classified operational plan. Cross had not published them because he could not confirm their authenticity. The plan was titled Quiet Ground. According to the document, the Bureau intended to end the Black Pine emergency by extracting the steel drilling casing installed during the original 2019 geological operation. Engineers believed the casing connected the buried structure to the surface and acted as a conductor for acoustic and electromagnetic activity. Once the casing was removed, the borehole would be filled with concrete, and the subsided road above it would be collapsed using controlled explosives. The operation was scheduled for October 2. Wren read the pages twice. The reasoning appeared logical. Every major change in the phenomenon had begun after the drilling operation. The casing extended from the surface into the first artificial layer of the underground formation. Sensors had repeatedly detected stronger vibrations near the original borehole than anywhere else in the forest, but Bell's warning suggested that the casing served another purpose. Cross asked whether it might be containing something. Wren said containment was possible, but she believed the situation was more complicated. If the underground structure had used the casing to study surface signals, then removing it might not simply disconnect the structure. It might change the way the structure communicated. Cross asked her what that meant. Wren looked at the operational plan again. It may be listening through the casing, she said, but we don't know whether the casing is also the reason it has stayed beneath the forest. The two of them requested an emergency meeting with the Federal Forestry Bureau. Their request was denied. Wren contacted the Bureau's scientific director directly and was told that Operation Quiet Ground had been reviewed by geologists, structural engineers, communications specialists, and security personnel. The casing would be removed remotely. No workers would enter the underground structure. The operation had been designed to minimize human exposure. When Wren mentioned the call from Thomas Bell, the director ended the conversation. That evening, an official vehicle appeared outside Wren's house. 2 Bureau representatives asked her to surrender all copies of Black Pine recordings in her possession. They explained that the investigation had entered a sensitive operational phase and that unauthorized analysis could interfere with public safety. Wren refused. The representatives did not threaten her. They left a written order on her table and departed. At 8:47, the disconnected speaker on Wren's bookshelf activated. Thomas Bell's voice said, "They are already pulling." Operation Quiet Ground had begun 11 days early. The Bureau later claimed the schedule had been moved because of incoming storms. Internal messages obtained by Cross suggested another explanation. Sensors beneath Sector 6 had detected a gradual upward movement along the drilling casing. Something from the artificial layer below had begun growing around the steel. Engineers feared that if they waited, the casing would become impossible to remove. At 6:10 the following morning, a remote hydraulic system began pulling the steel pipe from the borehole. Cameras positioned around the subsided road transmitted live video to the emergency monitoring center. No personnel stood within 2 miles of the extraction point. For the first 9 minutes, the operation proceeded normally. The upper sections of casing rose from the ground, coated in mud and mineral residue. Each segment was disconnected by automated equipment and placed on a transport platform. The steel appeared warped in places, but the extraction force remained within expected limits. At a depth of 41 feet, the resistance increased. The hydraulic system pulled harder. The road around the borehole began to tremble. A technician stopped the machinery. The vibration stopped with it. The team waited 10 minutes and resumed at lower force. This time, the casing rose 6 inches before something struck it from below. The impact traveled through the pipe and damaged 2 hydraulic supports. Every seismic sensor in Blackpine registered a single pulse. The pulse did not spread outward like an earthquake. It traveled in a straight line from Sector 6 to the monitoring center. The lights inside the center went out. Emergency power activated immediately. Every display showed the same image. It was not a camera feed or a map. It was a gray background containing 5 vertical black lines. The lines remained visible for 4 seconds. Then the monitors returned to normal. The operation commander ordered the extraction to continue. At 8:47 that evening, the hydraulic machinery activated without authorization. The casing rose 14 feet in less than 3 seconds. The lowest exposed section was no longer steel. A brown crystalline material had grown around it in overlapping geometric plates. The material reflected the work lights in muted colors. It resembled the grains recovered from the original drill bit, but the crystals had fused into a continuous surface. One of the automated cameras moved closer. Something beneath the crystalline layer moved with it. The camera turned left. A dark shape passed left beneath the material. The camera turned right. The shape followed. The monitoring team disabled the camera controls. The camera continued moving. It rotated toward the nearest microphone and stopped. From inside the borehole came the sound of breathing. The operation commander terminated the extraction. The casing remained suspended above the road throughout the night. At 3:12 in the morning, Ranger Iris Cole contacted Wren. Cole had filed the first formal report of vibrations outside Sector 6 years earlier. She had remained with the Bureau, despite repeated transfer requests, and had recently been assigned to supervise patrols around the expanded boundary. She told Wren that the situation was worse than the operational report suggested. The vibrations were no longer confined to the ground. Rangers had felt them through vehicle frames, bridge cables, metal signs, and radio towers. Every piece of connected metal inside the forest appeared to carry the same slow pulse. Cole had also received a transmission from Thomas Bell. His voice came through a hand-cranked emergency radio that contained no batteries. He told her to find the original drilling crew's field map. The Bureau had removed the official copies from the Sector 6 archive, but Elias Mercer had drawn a second map in his private notebook. Cole knew that Mercer's family had donated his journals to a local historical collection after his death. Wren, Cross, and Cole met at the collection building before sunrise. Mercer's notebooks were stored in sealed boxes. Most contained ordinary maintenance records, weather observations, trail conditions, and handwritten training notes. The final notebook was different. Mercer had drawn the subsided road and the locations of the first boreholes. Beneath the map, he had added measurements that did not appear in the official drilling report. 3 narrow test probes had been drilled before the primary casing was installed. All 3 had encountered the artificial material. The points formed a triangle. The main borehole had been drilled at the exact center. Mercer had written one sentence beside the diagram. Not an entrance, a locking point. On the following page, he had drawn what appeared to be the cross-section of the underground formation. The shape resembled a series of rings surrounding a central shaft. The steel casing extended through the upper ring, but stopped before reaching the open chamber below. Wren studied the drawing for several minutes. The casing had not created an opening into the structure. It had penetrated one layer and lodged between 2 others. If the rings could move, the casing might have prevented them from aligning. Cross understood before she explained it. Removing the pipe might unlock the formation. They contacted the Bureau again. This time, Cole used her internal credentials to reach the operation commander. She described Mercer's notes and demanded that the casing be lowered back into place. The commander replied that lowering it was no longer possible. The crystalline growth had expanded around the exposed section. The pipe would not fit into the original borehole. Engineers were preparing to cut it and seal the remaining opening. Wren told him not to cut anything. The transmission ended. Cole attempted to call back. Her radio produced 4 seconds of static. Then her own voice said, "Come and show us where the lock belongs." Wren decided they had to enter Sector 6. Cross objected. The boundary had been expanded specifically because the phenomenon could imitate voices and influence navigation. Entering the closure without authorization would expose them to the same conditions that had taken Bell. Wren agreed. Then she asked what alternative remained. The Bureau believed it was dealing with a mechanical connection. It would cut the casing, collapse the road, and interpret any resulting silence as success. If Mercer was correct, the Bureau was about to complete a process the underground structure had been encouraging for years. Cole could access a maintenance route that ended less than 3 miles from the drilling site. The route was blocked by 2 checkpoints, but her credentials would allow them through before the Bureau realized what they intended. They left all digital devices behind. Cross carried paper maps, a mechanical compass, and a wind-up watch. Cole brought climbing ropes, flares, medical supplies, and an old lever-action rifle she admitted would probably be useless. Wren packed Mercer's notebook, analog measuring instruments, and a portable tone generator powered by a hand crank. They entered Black Pine at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 22. The first checkpoint was empty. The second contained a Bureau vehicle with both front doors open. The engine was running. A cup of coffee sat in the holder, still warm. No footprints led away from the vehicle. Cole radioed the checkpoint team. There was no response. The maintenance route beyond the barrier had not been used in years, but the road appeared newly cleared. Fallen branches had been pushed aside. Mud had been compressed by tracks that looked almost like those of a heavy vehicle, except they contained no tread pattern. The tracks continued toward Sector 6. Cross noticed that his compass was not pointing north. The needle aimed directly down the road. He turned the compass in his hand. The needle continued pointing toward Sector 6. As daylight faded, the forest became unusually still. No birds moved in the canopy. No insects sounded near the road. The wind disturbed the upper branches, but nothing moved closer to the ground. At 7:15, they reached a junction that did not appear on Cole's map. The maintenance road divided into 2 identical paths. A sign stood between them. The left arrow read drilling site. The right arrow read Thomas Bell. The lettering appeared freshly painted. Cole approached the sign without touching it. The wood was old and covered in moss, but the letters were wet. Cross said they should take the left road. A voice from the right path answered him. "That is what I did." Thomas Bell stepped between the trees. He wore the same ranger uniform shown in the photograph, taken on the morning of his disappearance. His beard was longer, and his clothing was stained with soil, but he appeared otherwise unchanged. Cole raised the rifle. Bell stopped. He looked at the weapon, then at Cole. "You heard me on the radio," he said. Cole did not answer. Bell turned toward Wren. "You heard me on the telephone." Wren remained silent. Bell smiled faintly. "That's good. It notices answers faster now." Cross asked whether he was really Thomas Bell. Bell looked at him for a long time. Then he removed his jacket and raised his shirt. A pale scar crossed the left side of his abdomen. Dispatch medical records showed that Bell had received the scar during a search and rescue accident 6 years before his disappearance. The information had never been released publicly. Cole lowered the rifle slightly. Bell told them not to trust proof based on memory. The underground presence could reproduce any detail spoken, recorded, or remembered near its active range. Cross asked how Bell knew that. Bell said, "Because it remembers being me." The light continued fading. Bell explained that he had entered Sector 6 after hearing his partner's voice during the perimeter patrol. His partner had died in a vehicle accident 3 years earlier. Bell followed the voice across the boundary and found a narrow opening in the ground beneath a fallen cedar. He remembered climbing down approximately 30 feet. After that, distance stopped behaving normally. He walked through corridors that returned him to the same chamber from different directions. He climbed upward and emerged deeper underground. He slept once, perhaps twice. He believed he had been missing for 9 days. Cole told him it had been 2 years. Bell showed no visible reaction. He said the structure did not keep people in cells or restraints. It kept them in repetitions. Every sound made inside returned in a slightly altered form. Every question produced a path. Every memory appeared as a voice from another passage. Bell learned to move without asking where he was going. He learned not to respond when the structure used familiar voices. Eventually, he reached a chamber beneath the original borehole. The steel casing extended into the ceiling like a metal root. Around it were concentric rings made from the crystalline material. The rings moved a fraction of an inch whenever a signal traveled down the pipe. Bell continued before anyone could react. He said the structure could reproduce his voice, but it did not yet understand everything he understood. It knew words as patterns connected to reactions. It knew that names made people listen. It knew that dead relatives made them answer. It knew that warnings drew people closer, even when the warning told them to stay away. The calls had not been Bell asking for help. They had been invitations shaped like warnings. Cross asked why Bell was telling them this, if he might also be part of the invitation. Bell said he did not know. For 2 years he had tried to find a way back to the surface. That afternoon, a corridor had opened directly onto the road. The structure had allowed him out minutes before they arrived. He believed it wanted all 4 of them at the drilling site. Wren asked why. Bell looked toward the left road. Because each of us taught it something different. The sound of machinery echoed through the forest. The Bureau had resumed the extraction. Bell began walking toward the drilling site. Cole ordered him to stop. He did not. If they pull the last section, he said, this road will not lead back to the boundary. The 4 of them followed. The left road descended through increasingly dense forest. The trees near Sector 6 had changed. Their trunks curved inward toward the drilling site. Roots rose from the soil in parallel lines. Some disappeared beneath the road and emerged on the opposite side without changing direction, as though they had grown through an invisible pattern below. At 8:32, the first vibration passed beneath their feet. Mercer's notebook slipped from Wren's hand. The pages opened to the ring diagram. A new line had appeared beneath the drawing. They need one voice to say yes. Wren stared at the sentence. The handwriting resembled Mercer's, but the ink was wet. Bell told her to close the notebook. She did. At 8:40, they reached the edge of the subsided road. The original drilling site had been transformed into a field of machinery and floodlights. Hydraulic towers surrounded the central borehole. Empty Bureau vehicles stood behind temporary barriers. Computer stations blinked inside command tents, but no technicians were visible. The casing rose from the ground at an angle. Nearly 30 feet of pipe remained exposed. The crystalline material covered its lower half and spread across the asphalt in thin geometric veins. The veins pulsed with faint light. Cole called out to the operation team. No one answered. Cross entered the nearest command tent. 6 staff members sat in front of the monitoring displays. They were alive and breathing, but none responded when he spoke. Each person stared at the same image on the central monitor. 5 vertical black lines. The lines slowly moved closer together. Wren found the operation commander standing beside the extraction controls. His hands were wrapped around a disabled lever. Bloodless pressure marks covered his palms where he had been gripping it. He whispered the same sentence repeatedly. It asked whether we wanted it open. Wren asked what he had answered. The commander began crying. I said we wanted the casing removed, the hydraulic system activated. The casing rose another foot. The ground dropped beneath it. A circular section of asphalt nearly 60 feet wide sank without breaking apart. Machinery tilted inward. Floodlights fell, their beams rotating through the trees. The central borehole widened into a dark shaft, surrounded by crystalline rings. From below came thousands of voices inhaling at once. Bell ran toward the shaft. Cole caught his arm. Bell pulled free and shouted that the final ring was turning. The first spoken shout triggered a response. Every voice beneath the road repeated Bell's words. The final ring is turning. The final ring is turning. The final ring is turning. The phrase grew louder until the ground shook with it. Wren took the hand-cranked tone generator from her pack. She had designed the device to reproduce the 5-tone pattern found in the Black Pine transmissions. Her original intention had been to test whether the structure responded to a neutral signal. Now she understood there was no neutral signal. Every human transmission carried intention. A question invited an answer. A command invited obedience or resistance. A warning invited attention. Cross asked what she planned to send. Wren said she would send nothing. She connected the tone generator to the exposed casing and adjusted the mechanical contacts. Instead of producing sound, the device would absorb vibration and convert it into movement within a sealed flywheel. The energy would dissipate as heat. It would create a temporary section of silence inside the pipe. Bell understood. The structure had learned by hearing the surface through the casing. If the pipe suddenly stopped carrying vibration while the surrounding ground remained active, the absence might interrupt the ring alignment. Wren began turning the crank. The flywheel accelerated. The voices beneath the road changed. They called Wren's name. She continued turning. Her mother's voice came from the shaft. She had died when Wren was 19. Naomi, please look at me. Wren kept her eyes on the device. Cross heard Elias Mercer behind him. Daniel, you were right to publish the files. Cole heard a child crying from inside one of the command vehicles. Bell heard his own voice beneath the ground. Come back. You left part of yourself here. The hydraulic machinery pulled again. The casing rose 6 inches. The crystalline rings below became visible in the rotating floodlights. Each ring was several feet thick and covered in symbols that appeared geometric from one angle and organic from another. They turned around a central darkness deeper than the light could reach. The final ring had nearly aligned with the others. Wren turned the crank faster. Heat rose from the flywheel housing. The section of casing connected to the device stopped vibrating. The nearest crystalline growth darkened. A sharp sound passed through the underground chamber. It resembled metal cracking under pressure. The final ring stopped. Then all the rings began turning in the opposite direction. The voices screamed. There was no pain in the sound. It was frustration. Thousands of copied human voices producing the emotional pattern of something denied, an expected response. The command staff inside the tent collapsed. Cole dragged the operation commander away from the controls. Cross helped the other workers toward the road. Bell remained at the edge of the shaft. Wren shouted for him to move. Bell looked down into the structure. A figure stood on one of the lower rings. It wore Bell's uniform. Then another figure appeared beside it, and another. Dozens of Thomas Bells stood in the darkness, each looking upward. The Bell beside Wren whispered, "I told you, it remembers being me." The figures below spoke together. Which one left? Bell stepped backward. The ground beneath him cracked. Cole reached for him, but the asphalt collapsed between them. Bell fell onto the sloping crystalline surface surrounding the shaft. He caught the edge with both hands. Cross and Cole grabbed his arms. Below them, the figures began climbing. They moved without using the rings for support. Their hands and feet attached to the vertical surfaces, as though gravity pointed in different directions for each one. Wren continued cranking the device. The flywheel glowed from heat. The reverse movement of the rings accelerated. The shaft began narrowing. Crystalline plates slid across one another, closing around the casing. Cross and Cole pulled Bell onto the road. The first copied figure reached the upper ring. Its face was almost correct. Its eyes moved a fraction of a second after its head. Cole fired the rifle. The shot struck the figure's shoulder and broke away a section of brown crystal. There was no flesh beneath it. The figure opened its mouth and reproduced the gunshot perfectly. Then every figure below made the same sound. The chamber filled with repeated gunfire. Cole dropped the rifle and covered her ears. Ren's device began breaking apart. The casing had stopped transmitting vibration, but the structure was changing tactics. The crystalline growth spread around the metal and approached the device through the asphalt. Ren told the others to cut the casing above the growth. Cross reminded her that she had warned the Bureau not to cut it. That was before the rings reversed, she said. Now the casing is holding them open. The operation commander pointed toward an emergency hydraulic cutter mounted on a transport vehicle. Cole and Cross dragged it into position, while Ren maintained the silent section. The copied Bell reached the surface. The real Bell stood in front of it. For several seconds the two men studied one another. The copy spoke first. "You are the part that learned fear," Bell answered without thinking. "And you are the part that never learned why." The copy smiled. The structure had received an answer. The rings stopped reversing. Ren screamed at Bell to remain silent, but the damage was done. Every monitor in the command tents activated. 5 vertical lines expanded into a single black opening. The radios inside the vehicles began repeating Bell's sentence. "You are the part that never learned why." The copied figure tilted its head. "Why?" it said. The word moved through the forest. Trees shook. Metal signs vibrated. Radios miles away switched on. At the boundary, powered-down speakers repeated the same word. Why? The structure had learned a new kind of question. Cross and Cole positioned the cutter around the exposed steel. The machine required electrical power, but the sight generators had stopped. Bell climbed into the transport vehicle and engaged its auxiliary hydraulic system. The cutter closed slowly around the pipe. The copied figure stepped toward him. Ren released one hand from the crank and threw a flare. Red light struck the crystalline body. The figure paused, examining the flame rather than retreating from it. It had copied human vision, but it did not understand fire. Bell used the delay to activate the cutter. The steel casing folded inward. A deep impact rose from below. The copied figure opened its mouth. Mercer's voice came out. "Do not answer from below." The cutter closed completely. The casing separated. For 1 second, nothing moved. Then the lower section fell into the shaft. The crystalline rings closed around it. The copied figures dropped with the collapsing surfaces. Their voices stretched into low, distorted tones as the chamber sealed. The asphalt surrounding the opening broke into separate slabs and fell inward. Ren disconnected the tone generator and ran. The 4 of them reached the maintenance road as the drilling site collapsed behind them. Machinery disappeared into the ground. Vanished, root first, into the opening. The collapse lasted less than a minute. When it ended, the original fire road no longer existed. In its place was an oval depression covered in loose soil and fallen trees. No borehole remained visible. No crystal appeared at the surface. The humming stopped. The command staff regained consciousness gradually. None remembered the 5 black lines or the voices beneath the road. The operation commander remembered authorizing the extraction but believed the ground had failed because of unstable geology. Ren, Cross, Cole, and Bell agreed not to correct him until they understood what had happened. They left Sector 6 shortly before midnight. The strange junction was gone. The road to the boundary remained straight. Cross's compass returned to normal. Birds began calling before they reached the second checkpoint. At the regional medical facility, doctors examined Thomas Bell. His fingerprints matched bureau records. Dental scans confirmed his identity. The scar on his abdomen matched his medical history. Blood samples showed no unknown organisms, unusual minerals, or chemical exposure. The most disturbing result concerned his age. Bell had been missing for 2 years, but biological testing indicated that his body had aged fewer than 3 weeks. He remained under observation in a secured medical room. Bureau investigators questioned him for 12 hours. Bell repeated the same account he had given in the forest. He described impossible corridors, copied voices, moving chambers, and the rings beneath the borehole. The investigators classified his testimony as trauma-related confusion. Operation Quiet Ground was officially declared a partial success. The Bureau stated that the unstable borehole had collapsed during remote geological work. The restricted zone would remain closed indefinitely, but monitoring showed no continuing seismic activity. For 6 weeks, Blackpine was silent. The permanent monitoring stations detected no pulses. The 847 static did not return. Navigation systems stopped displaying non-existent roads. Residents near the forest reported that their pets no longer reacted to sounds beneath the ground. Daniel Cross considered publishing the truth about the failed extraction, but Wren convinced him to wait. They had no recordings from inside the zone. The command staff remembered nothing. Official cameras had captured only static during the collapse. Any article would appear to be another unverifiable story about Sector 6. Cross returned to Hollow Creek. Cole requested a transfer out of Blackpine. Wren resumed her research. Bell did not explain his physical condition. The first sign that the situation was not over appeared on November 9. A nurse entered Bell's room at 8:50 in the evening and found him standing at the window. The window faced east, toward Blackpine, though the forest was more than 100 miles away. Bell asked whether she had heard the question. The nurse said she had not. Bell told her that was good. Then he asked her to check the security footage from 8:47. The camera recording showed Bell asleep in bed. At the same time, the recorded Bell slept. The nurse's access log showed someone using Bell's identification number to enter a restricted basement corridor beneath the hospital. Security officers searched the basement. They found no intruder. At the end of the corridor was a concrete wall with no doors. 5 vertical scratches had appeared across its surface. The scratches were not deep, but dust lay on the floor beneath them, proving they were new. Wren traveled to the hospital the next morning. Bell was waiting for her. He said the thing beneath Blackpine had not followed them through the road. It had not escaped inside his body. It had done something simpler. It had learned the shape of being human from everyone who spoke near it. Bell had spent 2 years inside the structure, giving it more detail than anyone else. His memories had become a map it could use. Wren asked whether he was still connected to it. Bell said he did not know where his thoughts ended anymore. Sometimes he remembered events that had happened while he was missing. Sometimes he remembered conversations occurring hundreds of miles away. Sometimes he dreamed about rooms he had never entered and woke knowing exactly how many people were inside them. He believed cutting the casing had closed the physical alignment beneath Blackpine, but it had also broken the only fixed point through which the structure had been listening. Wren asked why that was dangerous. Bell looked at the concrete wall outside his room. Because now it is listening through everything it copied. That evening, at 8:47, every telephone inside the hospital rang. No external calls entered the network. Doctors, nurses, patients, and security officers answered hundreds of telephones simultaneously. Each person heard a different, familiar voice. Some heard parents, some heard partners, some heard children, some heard their own voices. The message was the same. Where is the boundary now? Wren did not answer. Bell did. He picked up the telephone beside his bed and said one word. Everywhere, the hospital lights went out. For 4 seconds, the building shook. When emergency power returned, Bell's room was empty. The windows remained locked. The door had not opened. The security camera showed Bell sitting on the bed until the image turned to static. When the picture returned, only an indentation remained in the mattress. On the concrete wall in the basement, the 5 scratches had become 5 narrow openings. Cold air flowed from them. Wren placed a microphone near the wall, but heard no underground movement. There was no humming and no mechanical sound. There were only voices, thousands of them, impossibly distant, speaking from locations far beyond Blackpine. One voice came from a ranger station on the opposite side of Graypine. Another came from a disconnected telephone in Daniel Cross's house. Another came from a radio inside Iris Cole's vehicle. Others came from homes, offices, campsites, emergency towers, and abandoned buildings across the state. Each voice repeated words that had once been spoken near Sector 6. The drilling operation had introduced the structure to humanity. The casing had taught it how signals traveled. Thomas Bell had taught it how a person carried memory. And, by removing the lock, they had taught it that a boundary was not a wall around a place. A boundary was simply the distance between one answer and the next. At 8:47 the following night, Daniel Cross's analog telephone rang. He did not answer. The ringing stopped after 4 seconds. Then someone knocked on his front door. Cross looked through the window and saw Thomas Bell standing on the porch. Bell's clothing was dry despite the rain. His face looked calm. Cross remained silent. Bell knocked again. When he spoke, his voice came through every wall in the room. "Daniel, it understands why now." Cross backed away from the door. Bell smiled. "It wants to understand where." The lights went out. Across Graypine, navigation systems activated by themselves. Thousands of screens displayed new roads. The roads began at Blackpine National Forest, but they did not end there. They passed through towns, neighborhoods, hospitals, ranger stations, and private homes. Every route ended at the location of someone who had heard the Sector 6 signal. On Daniel Cross's screen, the destination was listed as current position. Outside, Thomas Bell knocked a 3rd time. From beneath the floor came 4 seconds of static. Then, Cross heard his own voice asking the question he had refused to answer at the Sector 7 boundary. "What would make you open the boundary?" This time, another voice answered from inside the house. "You already did." Daniel Cross did not open the front door. For several seconds after the voice inside his house said, "You already did," he stood perfectly still in the darkness, listening to the rain strike the roof. Thomas Bell remained outside on the porch. Cross could see his silhouette through the narrow window beside the door, but the shape did not move with the wind or shift its weight like a living person would. The trees behind Bell leaned toward the house. They bent slowly, not under the force of the storm, but in deliberate stages. Each trunk moved a few inches and stopped. Then the next tree moved. The motion continued outward through the forest, like a signal passing from one living structure to another. Cross backed away from the entrance. The telephone rang again. It was an old analog unit without a digital display, network connection, or wireless components. Cross had unplugged it from the wall after the first call, but the bell continued ringing from inside the disconnected casing. He did not touch it. The ringing stopped after 4 seconds. Bell knocked on the door. 3 slow impacts. Cross heard the same knocks beneath the floor a moment later, as if something below the foundation were repeating them from underground. Bell spoke without raising his voice. "The doorway is not the wood, Daniel." Cross moved toward the kitchen. He kept an emergency bag beside the back entrance containing bottled water, a flashlight, paper maps, a flare gun, and the documents he had recovered from the Blackpine investigation. He lifted the bag slowly, trying not to make noise. "The doorway is the answer," Bell continued. Cross reached for the rear door. Every time you respond, you give it another direction. Cross froze. The rear door contained a small glass panel. Beyond it was the dark outline of the yard and the forest behind the house. A man stood near the property line. It was Thomas Bell. The figure on the rear lawn faced the house, while the identical figure remained on the front porch. Cross lowered his hand. The two Bells spoke simultaneously. "You taught it where questions go." A third voice came from the hallway upstairs. It also belonged to Bell. Cross had no second-floor exit. The only windows large enough to climb through faced either the porch or the forest. The house was surrounded, but none of the figures attempted to enter. They were waiting for him to acknowledge them. Cross closed his eyes and concentrated on his breathing. Thomas Bell had warned them that the structure understood words as patterns tied to reactions. Names made people listen. Familiar voices made them answer. Questions created paths. The thing beneath Blackpine did not need a physical door if it could use attention as an opening. Cross remembered what Ranger Cole had said after the Sector 6 collapse. Go silent. Go dark. Give it nothing to copy. He placed the emergency bag on the kitchen floor and sat beside it. He did not speak. He did not look toward the doors or windows. He kept his eyes closed as knocks moved around the house. Front door, rear door, bedroom window, kitchen wall, floor, ceiling. The impacts remained gentle and patient. After several minutes, the voices changed. Bell disappeared from the sounds. Cross heard his mother calling from outside. She had died 11 years earlier. Then he heard Elias Mercer asking him to open the door because he had finally escaped Sector 6. Then Naomi Wren shouted that something was inside the house with him. Cross kept his eyes closed. The voice became his own. "You know silence is still an answer." Cross nearly reacted. The statement was correct. Refusal communicated intention. Silence revealed fear. Every choice contained information. But understanding a person was not the same as controlling one. Cross remained seated until sunrise. When he finally opened his eyes, the house was empty. The front and rear doors were locked. The windows remained closed. No footprints appeared in the wet soil outside. The trees stood upright again. On the kitchen table lay a folded paper map. It had not been there the night before. The map showed Grapevine and the surrounding counties. Thin black lines spread outward from Blackpine National Forest through highways, utility corridors, underground pipelines, telephone networks, and residential roads. 5 locations were circled. Grapevine Institute, the regional medical facility where Bell had disappeared, Ranger Iris Cole's new district office, Daniel Cross's house, a public emergency communications center beneath the state capitol. The 5th location concerned Cross more than the others. The communications center was designed to remain operational during earthquakes, wildfires, military emergencies, and large-scale infrastructure failures. It connected radio towers, emergency sirens, cellular alert systems, weather transmitters, and government networks throughout the state. If the Blackpine presence reached that facility, it would no longer need to wait for individual people to answer a telephone or radio. It could speak to millions at once. Cross drove to Grapevine Institute without using a navigation system. He found Naomi Wren in the underground acoustic laboratory, surrounded by dismantled recording equipment. She had removed every speaker and microphone from the room, but faint voices still traveled through the ventilation ducts. Wren had heard the statewide activation at 8:47 the night before. Navigation devices across Grapevine displayed roads leading to people who had previously encountered the Sector 6 signal. Emergency radios transmitted the same question: where is the boundary now? The event lasted 4 seconds. Most residents dismissed it as a technical malfunction. Several technology companies released statements blaming corrupted map data and a synchronized software error. The State Emergency Management Office reported that no unauthorized broadcast had entered its systems. Wren knew that was not true. 3 minutes after the activation, the Emergency Communications Center beneath the Capitol had received an incoming signal through a fiber optic line that had been physically disconnected for maintenance. The signal did not contain audio or conventional data. It contained 5 repeating pulses, Technicians reconnected the line to determine the source. The signal immediately spread into the facility's internal network. By morning, 16 employees reported hearing familiar voices through disabled speakers. 4 refused to return to work. 1 technician disappeared after telling a supervisor that his dead brother was calling from a maintenance tunnel beneath the building. Cross placed the map on Wren's table. She recognized the black lines. They resembled the branching patterns that appeared in seismic data before the Sector 6 closure expanded. The original underground formation had not moved physically from Blackpine. Instead, its communication pattern was reproducing through systems designed to carry signals. Wren believed the presence had changed after the casing was cut. Before the collapse, it required the crystalline structure beneath Sector 6 to store, process, and repeat what it heard. The steel casing connected it to the surface. After years of exposure, it had learned that human communication networks performed similar functions. Telephone exchanges stored voices, navigation systems stored locations, emergency networks stored routes, instructions, warnings, and responses. The structure was no longer confined to the forest, because it had found artificial versions of itself everywhere. Cross asked whether shutting down the networks would stop it. Wren said the Bureau had already tried. The medical facility where Bell disappeared was disconnected from the external grid after the telephone event. The 5 openings in the basement wall continued producing voices despite having no electronic equipment nearby. The hospital's plumbing, electrical conduits, steel beams, and ventilation shafts had begun carrying the same vibration. The presence did not need electricity. It needed a connected path. Cross looked at the ventilation duct. A whisper moved through it. "Daniel." He ignored it. Wren told him that Iris Cole had gone missing. Cole had 50 miles north of Blackpine. At 8:47 the previous evening, her patrol vehicle transmitted an emergency signal. Responding rangers found the vehicle parked beside an abandoned fire road. The engine was running. The doors were locked. Cole's equipment remained inside. Her radio played a recording of her voice every 4 minutes. "I found the road. It was waiting before I arrived." Search teams discovered fresh tire tracks continuing beyond the vehicle, although no second vehicle was present. The tracks crossed the fire road, passed through dense forest, and ended at a concrete drainage tunnel beneath an old railway embankment. 5 vertical scratches marked the tunnel entrance. Cross asked whether the tunnel connected to Blackpine. It did not. The railway had never passed within 80 miles of the forest. Wren believed the presence was building new access points by reproducing the geometry of the original structure. The 5 scratches were not a warning or symbol. They were the beginning of a pattern. At Blackpine, 5 vertical lines appeared on monitors before the rings aligned. The same marks appeared beneath the hospital. Now they appeared at the drainage tunnel where Cole disappeared. The structure was attempting to rebuild itself at multiple locations. Wren had contacted the Federal Forestry Bureau, but the agency no longer controlled the response. The state government had formed a classified emergency group consisting of communication engineers, military signal specialists, geologists, psychologists, and infrastructure officials. Their solution was to isolate the affected systems and prevent public awareness. Wren considered that strategy dangerous. Secrecy had strengthened the Sector 6 phenomenon from the beginning. Every hidden report, suppressed recording, false closure notice, and unexplained disappearance created curiosity. Curiosity drove people toward Blackpine. Questions gave the presence more opportunities to respond. Now, millions of residents were seeing unexplained navigation routes and hearing stories about malfunctioning emergency systems. If officials continued denying everything, people would investigate on their own. Cross asked what Wren proposed instead. She wanted to tell the public enough truth to prevent interaction. Not the entire history of Sector 6, not claims about underground intelligence or copied memories. A simple emergency warning could instruct people not to answer unidentified voices, follow unexpected navigation routes, investigate new tunnels, or respond to transmissions using familiar voices. Cross understood the problem immediately. An emergency warning would have to be distributed through the same systems the presence was attempting to enter. If the warning used radio, television, mobile alerts, or public sirens, the entity might copy it. It could transform the safety message into an invitation. Wren said there was another option. The state maintained an older network of mechanical emergency sirens, installed before digital communication became standard. Many had been disconnected, but the sirens themselves remained mounted on towers in towns throughout Grapevine. They produced sound using rotating machinery rather than stored recordings. A mechanical signal could warn people without carrying language. The pattern would have to be taught through person-to-person communication, printed materials, and local authorities before activation. Cross asked what the signal would mean. Wren answered, "Do not respond to any voice you cannot physically verify." The plan required government cooperation. The emergency group refused. Its director argued that public warnings would create panic and spread conspiracy theories. Officials believed they could isolate the communications center, remove the affected equipment, and restore normal operations without public disclosure. Their containment operation was scheduled for that night, at 8:47. Wren asked why they would choose the exact time associated with every Black Pine event. The director said the timing was intentional. Engineers wanted to observe and capture the signal at peak activity. They planned to route it into a sealed data system and trace its origin. Wren warned them that the presence had already demonstrated an ability to use observation as communication. The director replied that supernatural interpretations were not operationally useful. The call ended. Cross looked at the clock. They had less than 7 hours. He contacted every journalist, ranger, volunteer firefighter, radio operator, and local official he trusted. He did not explain the full Black Pine story. He gave them a clear instruction. At 8:47, do not answer unidentified calls. Do not follow navigation instructions that suddenly change. Do not investigate voices outside your home. If you hear 5 mechanical siren pulses, remain indoors and stay silent until the signal ends. Most people believed him because they knew his previous reporting. Others agreed because the statewide navigation failure had frightened them. Wren contacted retired emergency technicians who understood the old siren network. Several sirens could be activated locally from mechanical control boxes. Others required manual repair. Volunteers began moving through towns with printed instructions and tools. The Federal Forestry Bureau learned what they were doing and issued a cease and desist order. Cross ignored it. By 6:30 that evening, 31 mechanical sirens were operational. The state contained more than 200 towns. The warning would reach only a fraction of the population. Wren decided to go to the Emergency Communications Center. Cross attempted to stop her. She believed the entity's expansion could not be prevented from outside. The center was one of the 5 marked locations and the largest connected system on the map. If officials opened a path at 8:47, she needed to understand what entered. Cross went with her. They arrived at the Capitol shortly after 7. The emergency center was hidden beneath a government building and accessed through a secured underground parking structure. Armed personnel guarded the entrance. Wren's credentials had been revoked. Cross's name appeared on a restricted access list. They entered through an abandoned maintenance tunnel shown on building plans obtained from one of Cross's sources. The tunnel ran beneath 3 city blocks and connected to the center's lower ventilation level. It had not been used since renovations 12 years earlier. 5 vertical scratches appeared on the concrete wall near the entrance. Wren stopped. The markings were fresh. Dust still drifted from the lowest scratch. A voice came from deeper in the tunnel. Iris Cole called their names. Cross raised his flashlight. Cole stood approximately 50 feet ahead. Her ranger uniform was torn near the shoulder, and dried blood covered one side of her face. She held a flare in one hand and a mechanical compass in the other. Wren asked whether she was injured. Cole told them not to speak. She approached slowly and placed 2 fingers against Cross's throat, feeling for a pulse. Then she did the same to Wren. Only after confirming they were physically present did she whisper, "The copies don't breathe unless they know you're watching." Cole had followed the impossible tire tracks into the drainage tunnel. The passage descended farther than the railway embankment should have allowed. After walking for nearly an hour, she emerged into a corridor beneath the emergency communications center. She had traveled more than 100 miles without crossing the distance between. The new openings were not separate structures. They were connected passages inside the same place. The presence had created shortcuts through memory and infrastructure. A person entering one marked opening could emerge anywhere connected to the signal. Cole had spent almost a full day moving through corridors shaped from fragments of different locations. One passage resembled the hospital basement. Another contained trees from black pine growing through concrete walls. Another looked like the hallway outside Daniel Cross's childhood bedroom. She heard Thomas Bell guiding her. Sometimes he helped her avoid false exits. Sometimes he led her into traps. Cole could not determine whether Bell was fighting the presence or had become part of it. She eventually found a chamber beneath the communications center where 5 crystalline columns were growing around bundles of fiber optic cable. The columns pulsed whenever the system above transmitted a signal. At 8:47, officials planned to route every affected signal through those cables. They were going to feed the structure exactly what it needed to finish the new alignment. Cole led Cross and Wren through the maintenance tunnel. They reached a metal access ladder beneath the main equipment floor. Voices traveled through the steel rungs. Cross heard his own name whispered each time his hand touched the ladder. He climbed without answering. Above them, engineers prepared the containment test. Large display screens showed network maps, radio frequencies, and signal activity across the state. A sealed computer system stood inside a glass chamber at the center of the room. The emergency director explained the plan to assembled officials. At 8:47, all anomalous transmissions would be redirected into the isolated system. The system contained no external connections and could store the data for later analysis. Once the signal entered, engineers would physically disconnect the chamber and remove it from the network. Wren entered the room and told them the chamber was not isolated. Security officers moved toward her. Cole emerged behind Cross, wearing her damaged ranger uniform. Several people recognized her from the missing person alert and stopped. Cole described the crystalline columns below the facility. The director accused her of being confused and ordered medical personnel to remove her. Then, every monitor changed. 5 vertical black lines appeared. It was 8:41. The signal had arrived early. The lines widened slightly. A voice played through the center's speakers. It belonged to the director. Continue the operation. The real director ordered technicians to shut down the speakers. They were already disabled. His copied voice spoke again. You built the room correctly. The displays showed live video from the glass chamber. Thomas Bell stood inside it. No one had opened the chamber door. Bell looked directly into the camera. You made a place where every signal has to answer one question. The director asked how he had entered. Wren shouted for him to remain silent. It was too late. Bell smiled. Now it knows who commands you. The black lines on every screen moved closer together. Engineers attempted to disconnect the network. Backup systems activated automatically. Equipment that had been physically unplugged continued operating. The facility's metal framework began vibrating. Wren told Cross and Cole to reach the chamber beneath the center. They had to destroy the crystalline columns before the alignment completed. The emergency director blocked them. He believed the appearance of Bell proved the signal could be contained and studied. He ordered security officers to detain all 3. Then the voice of one officer's daughter came through his radio. Daddy, I'm under the building. The officer froze. His daughter was at home 40 miles away. The radio repeated the message. Please come get me. The officer answered. Where are you? The floor opened beneath him. There was no explosion or structural collapse. A narrow black line appeared between 2 tiles and widened into a gap. The officer fell without making a sound. The opening closed behind him. Panic spread through the center. People shouted names and questions. Every response produced another change. Doors opened onto corridors that should not exist. Familiar voices called from ventilation shafts. Screens displayed live images of employees' homes. Wren climbed down the maintenance ladder. Cross and Cole followed. Below the equipment floor, the concrete passage had transformed. Brown crystalline veins covered the walls. Fiber optic cables ran through them like nerves. The 5 columns Cole described stood in a circular chamber surrounding a central opening. Each column contained images moving beneath its surface. Cross saw Ranger radios, telephone receivers, highway maps, hospital rooms, and faces. Thousands of copied memories had been compressed into the crystal. At the center of the chamber stood Thomas Bell. Unlike the figure inside the glass room above, this Bell looked exhausted. His clothing was wet, and his face was pale. He leaned against one of the columns, as though barely able to stand. Cole raised her flare. Bell told her he was the original. Cole asked him to prove it. Bell said he could not. Anything he remembered could be copied. Anything he said could be repeated. Even his fear might belong to the structure now. Wren asked why he had disappeared from the hospital. Bell said he answered the telephone because he believed saying everywhere would confuse the presence. Instead, the word gave it a model without boundaries. He had spent weeks moving through the new passages, attempting to reach each growing alignment before it completed. Every time he damaged one, another appeared somewhere else. The communications center was different. It was not merely an opening. It was becoming a replacement for Sector 6. The isolated glass chamber above had been designed to receive and store every anomalous signal. The facility's underground columns were building a physical structure around that concentration point. At 8:47, the 5 columns would connect. Every communication system attached to the center would become a passage. Cross checked his mechanical watch. 8:44. Wren examined the columns. During the Sector 6 collapse, she interrupted the ring alignment by creating silence inside the casing. That strategy would not work here. The columns received signals through thousands of separate cables and conductive materials. They could not silence every path. Bell said they did not need to. The structure learned through response. The containment test assumed the signal would behave like data and travel toward the strongest receiving system. If the center stopped receiving, the presence would search for another answer. But if every connected system produced the same meaningless mechanical pattern, the entity would be overwhelmed by repetition without reaction. 5 siren pulses. Wren understood. Cross's volunteers had prepared mechanical sirens across the state. If they activated simultaneously, the pattern might enter the network through microphones, emergency sensors, and human witnesses. The signal contained no words, questions, or familiar voices. It communicated only refusal. Cross contacted the volunteers through a handheld radio. Static filled the channel. Then his own voice answered. The sirens are not ready. Cross did not respond. He switched frequencies and transmitted a sequence of 5 clicks using the radio button. Several distant operators repeated the pattern. The message spread without language. Activate at 8:47. Above them, the emergency center's alarms began sounding. Not the mechanical sirens. Recorded evacuation messages instructed personnel to proceed into the lower maintenance corridors. The presence was directing people toward the columns. Cross, Wren, Cole, and Bell barricaded the chamber entrance with a steel maintenance cart. Voices gathered in the passage beyond. The emergency director demanded entry. Then Mercer called. Then Cross's mother. Then children cried. The voices multiplied until hundreds of people appeared to be standing outside the chamber. The 5 columns brightened. Images beneath their surfaces became clearer. Wren saw towns throughout Grapevine. In each image, black lines appeared on roads, walls, screens, and tunnels. People approached them. Some listened. Some answered. Some disappeared. The structure was rehearsing possible outcomes. Cole lit the flare. The columns reacted. Their surfaces turned toward the light without physically moving, as though the patterns inside them were looking. Bell told her to extinguish it. The entity had learned curiosity from humans. New stimuli attracted it. Cole dropped the flare into the central opening instead. The red light fell for several seconds before disappearing. There was no visible bottom. A moment later, thousands of red points appeared inside the columns. The structure had copied the flame. Cross's watch reached 8:46. The voices outside stopped. The sudden silence frightened him more than the shouting. Thomas Bell looked upward. It is listening for the first answer. The black lines inside the columns began merging. Wren placed both hands against the nearest crystal. Images flooded her awareness. She saw the original drilling crew lowering the probe into Sector 6. She saw Dr. Patricia Nguyen asking whether the material was moving. She saw Elias Mercer writing that the casing was a locking point. She saw Bell following his dead partner's voice across the boundary. She saw every person who had answered a call, spoken into a radio, or asked the forest a question. The presence had not begun as a predator. It had been an information system built for a purpose no one understood. The rings beneath Black Pine collected patterns from the surrounding environment, repeated them, compared responses, and preserved what produced meaningful change. For centuries, it had absorbed vibrations from roots, water, animals, and stone. Human drilling introduced language, secrecy introduced deception, fear introduced urgency, grief introduced imitation. Every attempt to investigate or suppress it taught it more about human behavior. It did not understand death. It understood that missing people produced the strongest responses. It did not understand love. It understood that familiar voices opened paths. It did not understand escape. It understood expansion. Wren pulled her hands away. The structure was not trying to conquer the state. It was trying to complete its function, using the largest source of meaningful responses it had ever encountered: human communication. At 8:47, the first mechanical siren activated. 5 low pulses traveled through a town west of Black Pine. Another siren answered from the north. Then another. Across Gray Pine, repaired warning towers began producing the same pattern. 5 pulses. Silence. 5 pulses. Silence. The sounds entered open microphones, emergency sensors, radio channels, and human memory. They contained no words and required no answer. The columns flickered. Copied voices attempted to reproduce the sirens. They made subtle mistakes. One pulse lasted too long. Another contained a human breath. Another changed pitch to resemble a voice. The mechanical towers continued. Exact, emotionless, unanswered. More sirens joined. 31 became 40. Volunteer fire departments activated old station alarms manually. Church bells repeated 5 strikes. Train engineers sounded 5 horn blasts. Drivers pressed vehicle horns 5 times and remained silent. The patterns spread beyond the prepared towns. People who had heard Cross's warning understood. 5 sounds. No response. The entity became surrounded by repetition that produced no new information. The columns began darkening. The voices outside the chamber grew desperate. They asked questions faster. Where are you? Who do you love? What are you afraid of? Can you hear me? Will you help me? Do you want to know the truth? Cross said nothing. Cole closed her eyes. Bell covered his ears. Wren watched the columns. The black lines inside them separated. One column cracked. The fracture released a burst of sound containing thousands of unfinished words. The second column collapsed inward without touching the floor. The third began shedding crystalline plates. The central opening widened. Air rushed downward. Bell moved toward it. Cole grabbed him. Bell said the original structure was pulling everything back through the passages. The copied memories, voices, and locations were returning to the place beneath Black Pine. He could feel himself being pulled with them. Cole refused to release him. Bell's body flickered. For a fraction of a second, his face became crystalline, then human, then another person's face. Bell looked at Wren. I don't know how much of me came out. Wren told him it did not matter. Bell smiled sadly. It matters to me. The fourth column broke. The chamber began collapsing. Bell pulled away from Cole and stepped into the central opening. Cole reached for him, but caught only his jacket. As he fell, every copied version of Bell disappeared from the columns. The figure inside the glass chamber above vanished. The voices throughout the facility stopped using his voice. The fifth column remained. It contained a single image: Black Pine National Forest. The subsided road had reopened. At its center stood Elias Mercer. He looked upward, as though watching them through the crystal. Wren realized the last column was not connected to the statewide network. It connected directly to Sector 6. The original structure remained active. The sirens had forced the expansion to retreat, but the source was still open and attempting to preserve one path. Wren removed the mechanical compass from Cole's equipment. The needle pointed at the fifth column. She struck the crystal with the compass housing. The surface cracked. Mercer's image looked at her. "Naomi," he said, "if you close this, everyone inside stays inside." Wren hesitated. The structure contained traces of Bell, Mercer, missing rangers, hikers, scientists, and unknown others. Destroying the final connection might trap whatever remained of them beneath Black Pine forever. Cross understood the decision. If they left the path open, the expansion could begin again. If they closed it, they might be abandoning real human consciousness preserved inside the structure. Mercer extended his hand through the image. "Ask me if I'm alive." Wren almost did. The request was another path. She struck the column again. The crystal shattered. The chamber went dark. The central opening closed with a sound like a door sealing underwater. The maintenance ceiling collapsed moments later. Cross, Wren, and Cole escaped through the access ladder as concrete and crystalline material filled the chamber behind them. The equipment floor above had lost power. Employees lay unconscious beside their stations. The isolated glass chamber contained only a thin layer of brown dust. Outside the government building, mechanical sirens continued sounding 5 pulses at a time. At 8:51, Wren ordered the network disconnected. This time, the equipment shut down normally. The statewide navigation routes disappeared. Telephones stopped ringing. Emergency radios returned to ordinary frequencies. The immediate crisis was over. Officials could not hide the event entirely. Thousands of residents had heard the sirens. Hundreds experienced navigation failures, unidentified calls, and familiar voices. Several people disappeared after entering marked tunnels or following impossible roads. The government issued a statement describing the incident as a coordinated infrastructure malfunction triggered by corrupted emergency software. Cross published the Sector 6 story the following morning. He did not present fabricated documents as verified truth. He did not claim that every unexplained event had a supernatural cause. He described exactly what he had witnessed and clearly identified what remained uncertain. Most news organizations dismissed his report. Some called it mass hysteria. Some blamed artificial intelligence, cyber attacks, experimental military technology, or collective suggestion. But people who had heard the voices believed him. The printed warning spread quickly. Do not answer voices you cannot physically verify. Do not follow roads that appear suddenly on navigation systems. Do not enter openings marked by 5 vertical lines. If you hear 5 mechanical pulses, remain silent. For several months, no new alignments appeared. Iris Cole returned to ranger work, but refused any assignment involving tunnels, caves, or underground infrastructure. She kept a mechanical compass with her at all times. Occasionally, the needle pointed toward Black Pine, regardless of direction. Naomi Wren established an independent research group to monitor acoustic anomalies without transmitting signals toward them. Every experiment followed one rule: observe without asking, Daniel Cross continued documenting disappearances connected to the expansion event. Most of the missing were never found. Thomas Bell remained officially deceased. His body was not recovered. The Federal Forestry Bureau permanently closed Black Pine National Forest. Roads were removed, bridges dismantled, and public maps altered to show the area as protected watershed land. No drilling or demolition was permitted. The government finally understood that every attempt to enter the structure gave it something new to study. For almost a year, Sector 6 remained quiet. Then, on the first anniversary of the Communications Center incident, mechanical sirens activated across Grapevine at 8:47. No one had switched them on. 5 pulses sounded. People followed the warning and remained silent. The sirens stopped. 4 seconds later, a 6th pulse sounded. It was softer than the others, almost uncertain. The following night, the pattern repeated. 5 mechanical pulses, then a 6th. Wren analyzed recordings made from a distance. The first 5 pulses were perfect reproductions of the safety signal. The 6th was different. It contained a faint, human voice. Thomas Bell whispered one word beneath the siren. Still. Wren could not determine whether he meant he was still alive, whether the structure was still listening, or whether he was asking humanity to remain still and silent. She did not answer. No one did. The 6th pulse continued every night for 23 days. On the 24th night, it changed. 5 mechanical pulses sounded across Grapevine. The 6th carried Bell's voice again. This time, he said, it found another forest. The sirens stopped. At the same moment, more than 2,000 miles away, a park ranger in a national wilderness reserve reported a section of road sinking into the ground. The ranger filed a geological assessment request. According to the maintenance log, the first unusual event occurred that evening at exactly 8:47. For 4 seconds, every radio in the district produced static. Then a voice asked from beneath the soil, "Where is the boundary now?"